Hello all, and welcome to this first in a series of presentations we call Understanding Ourselves and Others. The presentations use the long history of Calvert County with All Saints Episcopal Church as an example to discuss significant issues. My name is Cheryl Munn. I'm on the vestry, that is the church board here at All Saints, and I'm also chairperson of its Living Our Values Commission. And we developed this series to help live out our core values. Our purpose is to come together and to share in honest, respectful, and civil discussions to better understand one another. We believe that such understanding is essential to overcome divisions and better serve the community. Our presentation today is set in the Colonial Period when the brick church was built, and I believe you'll find it quite intriguing. Our next event, Sunday, August 1st, will start with a concert of music from the Civil War era. The discussion will explore the significance of the music and how these insights might apply to our time. The third event on Sunday, September 19th, will examine a time when our colonial church was in such disrepair that the Diocese of Maryland decided to end its 2.5 centuries of service to the community. But church members and many others across Calvert County came together to save it, and we'll consider how their example might apply to us today. And our final event for this series will be in November, and consider how formal institutions, including and perhaps especially established religion, might better meet the needs of young families and young individuals in this cyber age. We are very happy you joined us and encourage you to participate in all of the discussions. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Iona, a member of the All Saints Vestry and our Giving Back Outreach Commission. I have the honor of introducing the first of a 4-part discussion series to understand ourselves and others better. This part is hosted by the Giving Back Outreach Commission. Today we'll discuss who sat where in colonial times and why, and contrast it with who sits where now and why. Using the history of Calvert County All Saints Colonial Church as an illustration, we'll look at the impact of race and economics in the colonial period compared to present times. We'll consider where people were required to sit within the church building when it was built, when it was nearly the only option for Sunday morning worship in the area, to where people of our county sit today on Sunday mornings. And we'll discuss together how these and other factors influence our present day decisions and how comfortable we should be with the answers. Today's session begins with Father Ken Phelps presenting an historical analysis prepared by Professor Larry Hunt, followed by a brief music segment selected by our worship commission. Our discussion today will be led by Laverne Day and Tara Puglianti from the Community Mediation Center of Calvert County. We're very grateful for their participation.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and good afternoon. And as we begin, I just want to add my personal thanks to Dr. Larry Hunt for creating the presentation you are about to see. If we are to take seriously the goal of understanding each other, we have no choice but to begin at the beginning of the story and understand how this table was set, how slavery and the construct of race became the defining marks of colonial life in Maryland, and how they continue to exert an influence in our common life today. Current popular thinking is that race is an unchanging biological and historical reality. And one of the byproducts of this presentation will be to show how race is a cultural and evolving social category with fluid and shifting boundaries. Today, some people are thinking America has moved beyond black and white. The election of President Obama, the rise of a black professional middle class suggests to some that we are moving beyond race, becoming the multiracial society that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed about. Others believe, based on recent evidence, that a different story of America is emerging. One of a country still in the throes of a great unresolved struggle, sustained by deep-rooted systemic and institutional racism that is within our national DNA. Without commenting on the merits of such arguments, my task is to set before you a picture of colonial life in Calvert County, how the concept of race evolved, and how it became in practicality synonymous with racism, and how that manifested itself in day-to-day life, especially as it pertained to our parish. It is my hope that the question, who sat where and why, will not just be answered with what to most of us is the obvious, but that upon further reflection we may see how the dynamics of race and culture continue to impact our seating arrangements, and not just on Sunday morning, but where we go to school, where we work, where we choose to live and interact with community. The sharp black-white dichotomy which artificially divides the Calvert County population along racial criteria was largely non-existent at first in the Maryland colony. It was not part of the everyday life of the early colonial era. The race boundary gradually developed over the course of several generations, when indentured servitude died out and as a source of field labor, and lifelong slavery replaced it. I shall try to illustrate this point in several ways. First, how religion, rather than race, was the important basis of group membership in the first 40 years of the Maryland colony. Secondly, how race gradually came to be the marker of social standing by the political actions of a small minority who passed laws declaring slavery to be legal. And lastly, how frequently white women and black men engaged in consensual sex, producing a new type of person, the mulatto, a person that became a major legal issue in the Maryland colony. Race as a social concept was an invention of a powerful planter class and their political representatives. It was invented to stabilize a labor system that was immensely profitable to plantation owners, a small group that owned large tracts of land. Race became socially important only after religious differences between European and African populations were lessened by the work of Anglican ministers converting Africans to the values of Christianity. Because the wealth of landowners rested upon controlling the labor of others, the landowners had to convince themselves and others that it was within the realm of Christian justice to enslave other human beings according to the color of their skin, by claiming that social arrangements from which they profited were natural, moral, and reflected God's will. Their torturous reasoning can be traced in the laws they enacted that helped create the social inequities that continue to afflict us to this day. Now, during the early history of the Maryland colony, up to the founding of the Anglican parishes in 1692, of which All Saints was one, most common laborers, black and white, were indentured servants who were not owned and not legally bound to lifelong service. What was owned was not the person, but his or her contract or indenture, and the working person became free when the obligation of the contract was fulfilled. Both white and black indentured servants moved to freedom at the end of their contract. Most historians estimate that indentured servants outnumbered slaves by 4 to 1 around the year 1650, about 10 years after the first slaves had arrived in the colony. But by the early 1700s, that ratio was reversed, with 4 slaves for every indentured servant. It is quite likely that there were, in this early period up to 1650, more people of African descent who would work through their indenture contracts and became free persons of color than there were slaves of African descent. Also, it is important to note that many slaves in this early period were also Native American, captured in war. Slaves were not exclusively people of African descent. However, slavery as a lifelong service became legally defined in 1664 to apply to imported African and other, for example, Native American slaves. Here, the law attempted to clarify the master-servant relationship by creating the legal status of a slave as property, something that could be owned and sold. It is important to note here that slavery means a person could be bought and sold, not a contract, as in the case of the system of indenture. So in the years leading up to the founding of All Saints Parish and the building of the first All Saints log church, the people who lived here were becoming organized around the idea that race was the defining characteristic of the role that people would play in the parish. By 1700, there had been an increasing number of imports of blacks directly from Africa to fill the expanding work to be done. A slave was considered a wise capital investment, but only if the slave population could be effectively controlled. Enslaved Africans were forced into lives not of their own making and suffered deep longing for their homelands and lost families. The relationship between master and slave was one of continual tension, with the subservience of slaves demanded and reinforced by consistent, often harsh discipline. Slavery was hardly a pretty sight and took a toll on both master and slave. While there were no major slave revolts in Maryland, constant fear on the part of whites was a feature of daily life, not knowing where or when their slaves might rise up and protest. Whites attempted to regulate the slave population by outlawing assemblies on Sunday, when the slaves tried to gather and worship amongst themselves. Indeed, colonial law asserted that there could be no church service without a white pastor present. Bishop Whittingham's journal entries about All Saints during this period indicate that he would stop frequently in a field about 2 miles north of the church to conduct worship. Only 4 communicants were listed, but if we read between the lines, we know this was a slave gathering. Beyond whipping and other physical punishments for failing to wait diligently, there were also instances of violence against slave transgressions that served to intimidate and control the population from making any challenges to white domination. The full story of the parish requires we go back in history to establish some foundational matters. As we know, Maryland was a colony of England under a proprietary grant to the Calvert family. To understand the history of that English colony and the religious traditions that underline our parish, we begin with a comparison of England to 2 other colonial powers in the New World, Spain and Portugal. Both of these rivals to England were consistently Roman Catholic in their religious tradition, and most importantly, they were much closer to Africa geographically. Unlike the island nation of England, which was comparatively isolated from contact with Africa, both Spain and Portugal had long-standing, indeed centuries-old contacts with people of African descent, who at one time conquered them, and by virtue of past experience, they came to recognize Africans as fellow human beings who had the misfortune of being conquered, but not having a different essential nature. Of course, they recognized differences of color, but did not intend to assign a cultural meaning to those differences. Phrased differently, skin color was not a distinguishing characteristic or marker of a boundary that justified less than humane or Christian treatment of another group to the Spanish and Portuguese. England's attitude toward slavery was more complex and changed as it perceived need to generate economic growth in its colonies. English common law prohibited slavery within its boundaries. England fantasized itself as a special place, not unlike Camelot, a place with air so pure that, as the classic refrain goes, and here I quote, "Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free. They touch our country, their shackles fall." Such sentiment served as a rationale for freeing slaves brought to England from the colonies, and freedom was often granted by the courts as long as the person in question remained in England. What happened in English colonies overseas, well, that was another matter. When the parish system was founded in 1692, there were 2 parishes and 6 political divisions called hundreds in the current Calvert County. A hundred is a unit that sometimes refers to a subpopulation that's capable of supplying 100 fighting men to a local militia. or more frequently, it was a subunit containing 100 households. In Calvert County, there were 400s in Christ Church Parish in the southern part of the county, and 2 in All Saints Parish in the northern part. All Saints' northern boundary was with Anne Arundel County, from Lyons Creek on the riverside down to Hunting Creek, and on the bay side from Herring Creek down to Parker's Creek. Compared to Christ Church Parish, All Saints was the larger parish geographically, but smaller in population in those early years, having 2 compared to 400s. In the 1720s and 30s, there were efforts to undermine the Anglican establishment by attempting to reduce the tax paid to support the church, and by dividing some of the large parishes to reduce their political influence. These years saw numerous tax revolts in the Maryland colony. Still, the church was the central place for people to gather as community. It was here that a highly dispersed population during the week could come together. Beyond the obvious ritual functions of the worship service and the attendant traditional rites such as baptisms, weddings, and funerals, the absence of other means of communication meant that on Sunday, that was the day in which news was spread to the parish, both news of what was happening in the outside world, but also things going on within the parish. The Church of England was the most important institution in early colonial life. Now, as a key institution, churches were places from which social and governmental control emanated. Once the Church of England became the established church, the separation of church and state as we know it today was not present. Although each county had a civil government headed by a sheriff, the parish vestry and its rector were important components of regulation in community life. To illustrate, each county was authorized by the General Assembly to provide for a jail and other instruments of social control, such as the whipping post, pillories or stocks, and the ever-popular dunking stool. I don't know if Calvert County ever had a dunking stool to punish those who gossiped too much, but the practice of dragging people in the water behind boats was often used when no dunking stool was available. Although we can find no record of these devices being present at All Saints, they were often placed near churches in the colonial period. The vestry records of St. James Parish to our north contains multiple payments of tobacco for the building of stocks at the church. My best guess is that some of these devices were present on church grounds, perhaps where the labyrinth resides today. The vestry had considerable authority in the area of public manners and morals. Its main tasks were attempt to control illicit sex, that is, cohabitation without the benefit of marriage, and to punish blasphemy, swearing, and excessive drinking. Now, prior to 1660, there was little or no attempt to legally regulate interracial sex. The fact that it became an issue that prompted attempts at legal control is interwoven with attempts to make race the salient factor in social life in the colony. Early on, the issue of sex between a European and an African person was construed around religious differences, not racial differences. Early attitudes and initial attempts to legally control what we today would call interracial sex were more an attempt to limit so-called intimate contact between Christians and non-Christians. That behavior was a violation of religious precepts, not a violation of racial boundaries. Notice the language the Maryland General Assembly uses to condemn interracial marriages, describing them reflecting mainly the satisfaction of their lascivious and lustful desires, and to the disgrace not only of England, but also of many other Christian nations. During the early colonial era, interracial cohabitation and marriage was a fairly common thing among white and black indentured servants and slaves, as their daily lives and struggles were quite similar. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk. They resided together in the same dwellings. They spent what leisure time they had with one another. However, as it became clear that the importing of slaves would be essential to the production of tobacco, the main source and measure of wealth, laws were constructed to draw increasingly sharp lines between whites and blacks. Large plantations devoted to tobacco production needed a cheap, stable labor source. And when not enough indentured servants could be recruited, slaves became the main source of labor that produced the wealth of the Maryland colony. A 1664 law that legalized slavery in the Maryland colony not only specified that any Negro hereafter imported into the province shall be a servant for life, but that also any children born of a slave shall also be a servant for life. But most of the 1664 law concerned the freeborn English women, who, forgetful of her free condition and to the disgrace of the nation, do marry Negro slaves and produce children. The law specified that any freeborn woman who shall marry any slave from and after the last day of its present assembly shall serve the master of that slave for as long as the husband lives, and all the children of such freeborn women so married would be slaves as their fathers were. Court inventories of the Maryland colony document the punishment of many white women between the years 1680 to 1700, and an examination of the St. James Parish vestry records reveal numerous cases around the early 1700s. And there is no doubt that such punishment occurred in All Saints, as noted in the case of the mulatto indentured servants assigned to Rector Cockshut. More about that later. It is instructive to note that there was a considerable amount of interracial sex in the colony, and I should guess All Saints as well. While our conventional image is one of white slave owners coercively taking advantage of black slave women, a common theme depicted in movies such as Roots and 12 Years a Slave, there was probably as much or more consensual sex between white women and black men. Indeed, the regulation of the behavior of white women, because they were contributing greatly to the increasing number of mulatto births, was a major concern to the General Assembly. The vestry was also responsible to decide the fate of white women who had illicit sex with black men and produced a child called a mulatto. The vestry could offer the woman and child for sale to an interested buyer for a fixed period of servitude, usually 5 to 7 years for the woman, and for the child its first 21 years if the parents were legally married, and 30 years if they were not. Interestingly, the money from such sales went to the parish church, for the vestry to use as it saw fit. Sometimes a mulatto child could be assigned to be a servant to the rector of the parish. Indeed, the second rector of All Saints, Thomas Cockshut, who served from 1697 until 1722, held at the time of his death the indentures of 2 mulattoes. One valued at 20 pounds, whose name was Elizabeth and had 13 years yet to serve, and the other an unnamed man having 3 years to serve, valued at 12 pounds. Most of these children identified as mulattoes were the progeny of black men and white women. And since the mother is a free white person, the child also was born into freedom. But that presence was disrupted by the emerging sharp black versus white divide. When the reverse pattern occurred, that is, a black woman and a white man produced a child, that child was typically identified as Negro and a slave, not a mulatto and potentially free. After 1690, Maryland colonial law began to address the complexities introduced by the increasing number of mulatto children. In 1691, legislation invoked severe penalties for free white women who bore mulatto children. She was fined 15 pounds sterling, and if she could not pay, as was usually the case, she was sentenced to be sold for a 5-year term as servant. Indentured white women had an additional 5 years added to their term of service. In 1705, legislation became even more severe regarding mulatto children and specified that the children of free white women who had mixed-race parentage would be consigned to spend their first 30 years as an indentured servant to the local parish. This again is in all likelihood how Reverend Cockshut of All Saints Parish obtained his 2 mulatto servants. Now, before they were able to sit there, the question is raised about the idea of slaves assisting in the building of our brick church. Now, the first church at All Saints Parish was erected in 1693, shortly after the parish system was created. Church, as we saw, was an important part of community life in the English tradition, and most of the members of the parish had been born in England and were familiar with the Church of England. And all the people in All Saints Parish proceeded almost immediately to erect a log church after the Act of Establishment provided economic support for the parish church in 1692. It is clear that the labor of slaves produced the tobacco crops on which the wealth of the parish was based. Thus, there is no doubt that slavery was central to the capacity of the parish to erect the current brick structure. On the question of whether slaves took part in the actual physical construction of the building, I believe the answer is clearly yes, but I have not found yet any direct local evidence of the fact. I believe the answer is yes because we know that other major brick building projects in the Chesapeake colonies involved slave labor. Jefferson's Monticello, almost every building in Williamsburg, Virginia, and later the White House all involved the use of slaves at various points of construction. Additional evidence supported the proposition that slave labor was important in building the brick church at All Saints, coming from the more complete vestry records of our adjacent parish to the north, St. James. It is clear that when builders were contacted to build a church at St. James, the vestry agreed to supply a complete parcel of men to be ready to work whenever required. While this might mean a number of church-ready or church member volunteers, that is not likely. Some specific records strongly suggesting that slaves were used on a variety of church projects are found in the funds dispersed by the St. James Vestry. Records that read, 200 pounds of tobacco paid to William Locke, Esquire, for causing 2 horse blocks to be made. 1,820 pounds to Thomas Tench, Esquire, for nails and his servants, cording of 8,000 feet of planks for use by the church. 200 pounds to Stephen Freeland for laborers' work done. These records do not give names to those doing the work, but it is difficult to imagine them being other than slaves of members of the parish. In the case of All Saints Church, we know there were 2 named builders, Thomas Cleland and Thomas Heathman, but there is no record of what must have been a sizable labor force to make the bricks, transport them, and at a minimum assist the bricklayers and or do the actual laying of the bricks under the builder's supervision. Looking at it from a practical standpoint, one cannot imagine a skilled bricklayer working at heights, climbing up and down a ladder to fetch bricks from the ground and carrying them up a ladder to be put into place with mortar. Many people other than the 2 named builders must have played roles in the construction process. The best guess is that Cleland and Heathman were not slave owners, as they were not major landowners and probably did not have the resources to transport and feed the workforce necessary to erect such a large building. These considerations are highly suggestive that local slaves played a role in the construction of All Saints, but again, admittedly, not definitive. And the building itself, the place where people sat. All Saints is 60 feet by 50 feet, a 2-level structure which was very large for its day. Compared to most of the other parish churches built in the 17th century, it is distinguished by this larger capacity, that is, the sheer number of people it could hold, and also by its unique containment of 2 full-length galleries. These features speak to the prosperity of the landowners in the parish and also to the large number of slaves that needed to be accommodated. In 1844, the 4th Bishop of Maryland, Whittingham, visited All Saints, and he estimated the church's seating capacity at 500. My own estimate comes out about 100 less for today's configuration of pews and benches. My estimate uses a figure for 1 seat, 18 inches wide, the standard for most major airlines in the coach class, and suggests that each of the galleries could hold 90 people, making for a total of 180 on the 2nd floor. My estimate for the main floor is somewhat higher, a figure of 200, making the total capacity 385. We don't know what the original configuration was, but probably there was much less obesity in those days and more people could fit into a given space. I will remind you all that President Madison was only 5'4" and probably only 95 pounds. So maybe the good bishop's estimate of 500 was right. Now, a dramatic component of the basic design or architecture of the building, the galleries were erected to provide space for slaves and poor whites who could not attend or afford to rent or purchase a pew on the main floor. The galleries at All Saints are probably the largest for any Maryland church built in the colonial era, and that still stand today. The creation of the galleries clearly reflected an attempt to segregate congregants by race and class. They allowed for the separation of a rich landowning class or others of means from slaves and from whites or free blacks with lesser resources. Thus, a definitive race and class system is reflected in the basic architecture of our church structure. Galleries permitted the attendance of all variety of persons at the same worship service. In smaller churches, a common practice was to segregate by time of service, with whites attending the morning service and an afternoon service for the colored communicants. Now to review, slavery became a matter of law in the 1660s. Black labor gradually replaced white labor. Direct importing of slaves from Africa increased so that by 1700, blacks directly imported from Africa formed 75% of the slave population. During this time, black males were desired for field labor, and they were imported at 3 to 4 times the frequency of females. So around 1700, shortly after the first log church had been erected in All Saints Parish, there were an increasing number of black slaves in the parish. My best guess is that people of African descent constituted about 1/5 of that total population. This largely male slave population lived in isolation with little contact with black women. With almost no birth rates adding to the population and fairly high death rates among the early arrivals, the only mechanism of population resupply was importing more and more slaves. Death rates were high due to general living working conditions and the fact that people newly arriving from Africa had little immunity to diseases that flourished among European populations. The history of how Europeans brought new germs to the New World is well documented, having devastating impacts on both Native Americans and people imported from Africa. So from early colonial times through the first quarter of the 18th century, the black population did not increase naturally, but was replenished only by continuing import of males for the field work of clearing land and planting crops. Committed to hard outside labor of clearing the forest and planting and harvesting tobacco crops, these field hands were central to the whole production system. Slaves not only removed the trees that were in the fields, they transformed the woods into productive fields where the tobacco was produced. And they remained near those fields for the labor-intensive work involved in planting, weeding, and harvesting the tobacco crop. They spent most of their time working on the land and probably did not attend church with any frequency. The male slave population at the time had almost nothing in common with the landowning white population. But as they began laying the foundations for the prosperity of the parish, eventually the construction of the brick church followed. And by the time the brick church was built in 1776, things had changed dramatically. The population of the parish had come to be one in which there were more people of African descent than of European descent. Whites were a slight numerical minority, a pattern that continued in Calvert County for the next 100 years and ended only with the victory of the North in the Civil War, when many freed slaves departed the state for other places of residence in the North. By 1776, the task of clearing large areas of land had been accomplished. Landowners had managed to build up extensive holdings and by their success started in motion patterns that would create some semblance of family life for African Americans, the natural increase of the African American population, and also their increased presence in the life of the church. Now, to ensure a stable source of labor and insulate their estates from fluctuating prices on the international slave market, the large landowners began importing more African women as slaves. The sex ratio of the slave population brought to Maryland around 1700 was of the order of 3 to 4 males for every 1 female. But in 20 to 30 years, the pattern changed in the direction of greater balance. It was only after 1720 that the black population began to increase naturally, and ironically, that development was due to the increasing wealth of white owners of large plantations. The larger, more prosperous manors generated an increased demand for female slaves, both to assist in the demanding amount of domestic work critical in running a large manor household, but also as a means of generating a new generation of slaves by their reproductive work. Plantation owners recognized the value of women slaves. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson's famous quote crystallizes the slave owners' attitudes that began emerging in the early 1700s. Jefferson reported to his overseer, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." This greater female presence in the black community also meant more family formation and the greater production and rearing of children who, by matter of law, were destined to be slaves as well. My guess is that it was only after more black females were imported and black families began to be formed with the birth of children that there was much concern on the part of most whites with incorporating the slave population into the church. Said differently, as long as the slave population was largely adult males directly imported from Africa, there was little concern with their spiritual life. Later, when black women and children were present in increasing numbers, there was more resemblance between black and white populations, and more basis for recognizing the common humanity. There's good reason to think that it was the colonial white women that were behind the push toward the inclusion of slaves in the life of the church. White women and black women were in daily interaction around the household. And this greater daily proximity and increased frequency of interaction, through that they also shared the experience of birthing and raising children, and all of this likely led to closer interrace relationships among the women of the plantation. As we know, white women were active in the anti-slavery movement, and for both blacks and whites, women tend to run the church, even though the titular leaders more often were male. To summarize then some of the ground we've covered as it pertains to the Anglican establishment and the later Episcopal Church. Slavery was justified as part of God's natural order. The economic fruits of slave labor, tobacco primarily, financed the church and its activities. Priests often owned slaves. Bishop Clagett's family owned 32 at one point in time, though the bishop himself was only reported to have 2 who often traveled with him. Within the life of the parish, slaves were baptized Christians, and the records we do have, especially Bishop Whittingham's journal when he recorded his pastoral duties within All Saints, be they weddings, baptisms, or funerals, use the designations N for Negro or S for slave to indicate race and status. Slaves attended regularly, and they were placed in the galleries. Emancipation, as we know, changed everything and brought sweeping changes to religious practice and affiliations as far as they were concerned. After the Civil War, when those who had been enslaved were now free, many left the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church of the South as well. They joined either the independent black congregation or denominations of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was formed in Philadelphia, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, founded in New York, and also the recently formed Northern Methodist Episcopal Church, which was by that time already planting congregations in the South. Now, based on research of family names and other sources and stories that we've collected, we are led to believe that there are several churches, all Methodist, which organized during and after the Civil War, wherein the enslaved of All Saints had gravitated after the war. Most prominent among them were St. Edmund's, founded in 1868, and Mount Hope, which was formed in 1860. Those congregations list surnames of many All Saints families among their original membership, among them names like Freeland and Chu and Makel. Now, in recent years, in large part due to the efforts to reconcile our past both as All Saints and the Episcopal Church as part of the larger Trail of Souls movement of the diocese, we've begun once again to enjoy collaborations with our sister churches on a number of projects, including those involving youth leadership development, safe nights, and anti-racism efforts. And realizing that wealth divide established in the colonial period still persists and impacts our society on both an individual and institutional basis, All Saints has begun a primary mission, the aim of which is to create housing opportunities that will assist in closing that gap. It is known as the Calvert concept and has as one of its objectives the creation of a prototype appropriate for nationwide application. We're also in the process of inviting others to partner with us, so please, if you are interested, contact the parish.
I've been around a while, I know wrong from right, learned a long time. I know wrong from right, learned a long time ago. Things ain't always black and white. Just like you can't judge a book by the cover. We all got to be careful how we treat one another. I say, skin deep, skin deep, underneath. We all look the same. Skin deep, skin deep, underneath. Don't we all look the same? A man in Louisiana never called me by my name. He said, boy, do this and boy, do that, but I never once complained. I knew he had a good heart, but he just didn't understand that I needed to be treated just like any other man. Skin deep, skin deep, underneath. Though we all look the same. Skin deep, skin deep,
underneath. We all look the same.
I sit my child down when it was old enough to know. I said, out there in this big wide world, you're gonna meet all kind of folks. I said, son, it all comes down to just one simple rule, that you treat everybody just the way. You want them to treat you